In 1345, a baker in London was tied to a wooden frame and dragged through the streets. Around his neck hung the evidence, a loaf of bread. It was too light, not stale, not rotten, just lighter than the law allowed. The bread weighed less than what a penny should buy, and for that, the city made a spectacle of him. This was not unusual. This was the system working as designed. And it tells you something important about what people actually ate in medieval taverns, because the first thing to understand is that almost none of it was optional. The food was regulated, the drink was regulated, the days you were allowed to eat meat were regulated. What ended up on your table was not a matter of taste, it was a matter of law, season, and what the church permitted that week.
Start with a distinction most people skip. A tavern, an alehouse, and an inn were three different things, and the difference mattered to everyone who walked through the door. A tavern sold wine, and was the most expensive of the three. An inn offered lodging and a meal, usually near a road. An alehouse was the cheapest and most common, and for most of the medieval period it was not really a business at all. It was someone's house. A woman brewed ale in her kitchen, hung a bush or a broom above her door to signal a fresh batch, and her neighbors came in. These women, called alewives or brewsters, dominated the trade for centuries. Court records from English towns treat brewing as an almost entirely female occupation. The alehouse had no menu, no separate dining room, and no sign with a name on it. You sat in a woman's front room, drank what she had made that week, and if there was food, it came from her hearth.
The food that most people actually ate, whether at home or in an alehouse, was pottage. A fixed stew of whatever was available, kept simmering in an iron pot over the fire, sometimes for days. You did not order pottage, it was simply there. The base was water or stock, thickened with oats or barley. Into that went whatever the season offered: leeks, cabbage, onions, turnips, beans, peas. If you were lucky, a piece of salt pork or a bone. The pot was rarely emptied completely. New ingredients went in on top of what remained. This was not poverty cooking in disguise. It was the ordinary meal of most of Europe for several hundred years. The Cuxham Manor accounts from the 1320s, one of the most detailed records of medieval English rural life, list the rations given to laborers: grain for bread, grain for ale, dried peas, and occasionally cheese. Meat appears, but not often. Pottage was the center of the diet, because grain was the center of the economy.
The bread itself had a second function that sounds strange until you think about it. A trencher was a fixed slab of coarse bread, usually 4 days old, cut to about 6 inches across. It was your plate. You put your meat or stew on it, ate the food, and the bread soaked up the juices. In a wealthy household, the used trencher was collected after the meal and given as alms to the poor or tossed to the dogs. In a poorer house, you ate the trencher yourself. It was the whole meal. The bread was made from maslin, a mix of whatever grain was cheapest, usually rye and barley, sometimes oats. Pure wheat bread was expensive and went almost entirely to market or to noble tables. What a laborer ate was dense, dark, gritty, and filling. A standard loaf weighed roughly 4 pounds. Its weight was not set by the baker, it was set by law. The Assize of bread and ale, established around 1266 under Henry III, was one of the most widely enforced statutes in medieval England. It did something clever. The price of a loaf of bread never changed. What changed was its weight. When grain was cheap, a penny bought a heavier loaf. When grain was expensive, the loaf shrank. The same principle applied to ale. Official tasters visited ale houses, checked the strength and quantity, and fined anyone who watered it down or sold short measures. The penalties were real. Repeat offenders lost the right to brew. Bakers who cheated were publicly humiliated. This was not a footnote of medieval law. It shaped what every tavern and alehouse could serve, and at what cost. The system lasted, in various forms, for over 500 years. The church calendar dictated your diet more than any cook did. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were fast days. So was all of Lent, all of Advent, and various saints' days scattered through the year. Added up, and roughly a third of the calendar prohibited the eating of meat. On those days, you ate fish, or you ate nothing with flesh in it at all. During Lent, even eggs and dairy were forbidden. This was not optional, it was enforced, and it was universal. A tavern in London followed the same calendar as a farmhouse in Yorkshire. The result was an enormous demand for preserved fish, especially salted herring and dried stockfish, a wind-dried cod so hard it had to be beaten with a mallet and soaked for days before it could be cooked. You have almost certainly seen a piece of stockfish in a painting or a museum without knowing what it was. It looked like a gray wooden plank. It tasted about as good as that sounds.
There is a popular belief that medieval people drowned their food in spices to disguise the taste of rotten meat. It is almost certainly wrong. The argument against it is simple economics. In 15th century London, a pound of saffron cost roughly 183 pence. A pound of gold cost 240. Saffron was 3/4 the price of gold. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were all luxury imports carried overland from Asia. The people who could afford these spices were exactly the people who could afford fresh meat. The idea that they bought the most expensive seasoning in the world to cover up spoiled food makes no sense. The myth traces largely to one book, J.C. Drummond's The Englishman's Food, published in 1939, which speculated without evidence that heavy spicing indicated tainted ingredients. Medieval recipe collections like The Form of Cury, compiled around 1390 by the master cooks of Richard II, spice vegetable dishes just as heavily as meat dishes. The spicing was the cuisine, not a disguise.
By the 1300s, London had something that looks remarkably like a fast food industry. Cookshops lined Eastcheap, Thames Street, and the lanes near the river. These were open-fronted shops where a cook roasted meat on a spit or kept pies warming on a shelf, and you bought what you could afford and ate it standing up or took it home. Many of the customers were laborers and apprentices who lived in rented rooms without kitchens or hearths. A cookshop was not a luxury, it was the only way they could eat a hot meal. The Liber Albus, London's book of civic regulations compiled in 1419, treated food sellers with open suspicion. It grouped their regulations alongside laws dealing with rebellious persons. City inspectors, called searchers, had the authority to enter any cookshop, taste the sauces, check the freshness of the meat, and shut the place down if they found the food corrupt. The records suggest they often did. Strip away the myths, and what remains is a diet built on bread, ale, and stew, shaped by the price of grain and the demands of the church, and enforced by local officials who could fine you or shame you in public. It was not romantic. It was not disgusting. It was functional. The ale was thick, cloudy, and sweet because hops were not widely used in England until the 15th century. The bread was dense and dark. The pottage was bland unless you could afford onions and herbs. On roughly 200 days a year, you could add meat, usually salt pork or bacon, occasionally a roasted bird if you had money. On the other 130 days, you ate fish or you ate nothing but bread and stew. A meal at a medieval alehouse was not an event. It was a calorie delivery system, constrained by economics, religion, and season, and almost entirely run by women who brewed in their own kitchens. That is what people really ate.
Most of what you have been told about medieval food comes from banquet records of kings and nobles, because those are the stories that survived. The daily meals of ordinary people left almost no trace, except in tax rolls, court fines, and the account books of manors that counted every bushel of grain. The real history is in the ledger, not the legend. If that is the kind of detail you come here for, there is more ahead.